Right, that's just loud. Well, good afternoon. We've got a double dose of HF propagation and ionospheric propagation for you this afternoon. I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Ruth Bamford to the convention. Ruth's a plasma physicist from the Rutherford Atom Laboratory. We owe a big debt of gratitude to RAL because they have an Ionosonde that we use on a regular basis, and they also host to a number of beacons that we use in our bands and some of the other bands as well. So I'm not going to rattle on too much. I'm going to pass it over to Ruth, who's going to talk about the ionosphere, ionosondes and solar eclipses, and then after the break I'm going to talk about propagation. But she'll do a better job than I will because she knows what she's talking about.
I'm not going to talk about propagation. Thank you very much, Steve. Sorry, can we turn the lights, because I like using... Sorry, I like using dark backgrounds and it makes it look...
There we go. To stay incognito.
That too. But I like using the spacey theme. Yes, thank you very much, Steve, for that introduction. Yes, I'm at the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory. Now it's called STFC, Science and Technology Facilities Council. That's the overarching body. But most of us scientists still use the address because we know the import of that and the history. And particularly relevant to this conference, of course, is the Appleton part of it, for which the Ionosondes is the very experiment for which he got, in part, the Nobel Prize. So I'm going to talk to you about the current state of the Ionosonde programme. I've got a couple of colleagues, in particular John Bradford is the engineer, so who keeps them all going with luck, cough and spit. You've got two sides of the planet, and Sarah does the management. And I have a colleague in University of Reading who likes to analyse the data quite a lot of the time. And what I'm going to talk about here, it's going to be a bit different from your other talks here, is talk about the nature of the ionosphere itself. I'm sure you're also familiar with its vagaries and its changeabilities and its moods. So, without getting too much detail of the complete complexity, because I'm not even sure I'm qualified to do that, but I'll give some indication of the basic shape and form and why it is that way and why it changes that way, and a little bit of the history and how we monitor it with the Ionosonde network, and right at the end, a little bit of what we saw during the eclipse in '99, which some of you may remember. I spoke in the convention at Windsor on that occasion, but not so much this time about the eclipse we had in March, and I'm going to leave that to Steve, but I'll show what the Ionosondes record and what we understand from that. So, now this is something you all very well know. The ionosphere plays a pivotal role in nearly every band of communication we have, including, needless to say, electric communication satellites and GPS, because the ionosphere produces phase errors and corrections that are required to be accommodated for pretty well every source of navigation. I'm not going to talk about that, but talk about the use of it in its reflective capacity for point-to-point communications. Now, because I know everybody loves to see pictures of masts and kit and things. This is the Chiltern Ionosonde. It's just south of Oxford. This is the continuation of the original one that was at Slough, which it's still sometimes recorded as being at Slough, but actually now it's a couple of miles up the road in Chiltern, at the back of our site. We have a box here, which is actually a semi-commercial unit, and it's 20 years old, odd. And we have an arrangement of antennas and masts. I'll show you a little bit more about those in a minute. We also have a sister Ionosonde station, which is in Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands. And there it is in the wild and woolly scenery. We did have a bit of trouble, health and safety-wise, after the Falklands War with landmines. They also blew up the hut, thinking it was a more dubious purpose than it actually was. So we do have a little data gap around the 80s. But the reason we have the Falkland one is because there between the UK and the Falklands, we're actually at conjugate points on the magnetic field. So for long-term monitoring of both hemispheres, both the Falklands and Chiltern mark unique spots and a unique database, and worth continuing for that very reason. And here again, the kind of things you like to see. This is actually a schematic from the most recent Lowell Digison, which is not what we have, but the component parts are the same. Outside we've got, well, we've actually got a rhombic, so it's the ends are a little off the ground rather than these sloping V's and triangles. But the propagation pattern, of course, is vertically upwards. So this is the transmitter antenna, and then we've got an array of receive loop antennas crossed to get both polarizations. And the indoor components, we have a GPS slot for timing, and essentially what the Ionosonde does is it sweeps in frequency from 2 to 30 megahertz. We do it consistently every hour, and consistently every half an hour. We kind of state we will definitely do it every hour, but in fact we try as much as possible to run every 5 minutes. And we're guaranteed to work at even faster schedules if there's an interesting event going on, such as an eclipse.
She's given us all that QAM.
Yeah, it's a bit noisy. We could make it quieter. We should come to that at the end. Anyway, what its basic function is, we transmit that swept frequency vertically upwards, and we pick up the received signal back down at the same location. So it's a vertical sounder, and from that what we're measuring is we're trying to get this profile of the changes in number of electrons in the upper atmosphere by vertically sounding it. So we're not actually attempting any communications. We're trying to monitor the environment of the ionosphere directly above us. A lot of you will see this, be very familiar with this. This is the intensity or concentration number of electrons and altitude. And the space station, of course, is just about the F region of the ionosphere. And this part of the atmosphere, the stratosphere, is below here, and balloons and everything else is far below here, as you know. It's a very interesting and peculiar profile. And we'll ignore the history behind the labelling, because there seems to be a bit of controversy between what people say it's for. I understood that originally it was for EF, electric field, but people have said that isn't the case. So I'd love to know if anyone actually knows for sure what the reasons are. But what I want to talk about a little bit now is, why is the profile this weird set of undulations? Why do we actually even label certain layers as layers, and actually have to introduce a strange convention when we find a new one that's in between two others which were originally found? So this brings us to, how is the ionosphere formed? Now, please excuse me if I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but start from the beginning. If you've got atoms in the Earth's atmosphere, which have got both a positive charge and electrons, if you have an intense radiation source, say from the sun, it can ionize. It can give enough energy to the electron to release it from the ion, and what you end up with is ions and electrons separately. And it tends to happen at energies where the wavelength is appropriate for tuning into the atoms. So for the atoms in the upper atmosphere, these tend to be the X-rays and the extreme ultraviolet. And what you end up with, if you've got a lot of light, you end up with separate ions and separate electrons. And this state of matter, which is the fourth state of matter, is called a plasma. If you heat a solid, you get a liquid. If you heat a liquid, you get a gas. If you heat a gas, you break up the atomic bonds and you end up with a plasma. Now, it's worth calling a plasma a separate state of matter, because unlike a gas, the particles are interconnected without colliding themselves by their electric fields. So they're a mysterious beast that is actually very hard to predict and control, because they've got so many interrelations, you can interact with something here, but because it displaces charge, it will affect things over there, without there being enough particles together that they actually physically collide in that sense. Now, in terms of the ionosphere, it's actually a dirty plasma, what we would call in the laboratory a dirty plasma. It's got a lot of, well, the air we breathe. But at the altitudes we're talking about, it's diffuse enough that the plasma doesn't necessarily recombine immediately to form atoms, and it keeps hot enough, and it keeps being generated by the radiation from the sun. So what we end up with is a situation where we've got a balance, basically, between the nature and the type and the intensity of the ionizing radiation from space, coming down and producing the ions and electrons, and the counterbalancing pressure of the atmosphere and the density of the atmosphere, and also the composition of the atmosphere, which are trying to annihilate and recombine the ions and electrons and make it neutral atoms again. And it's through this kind of balancing, which I've plotted here, sort of, obviously the concentration gets less and less with altitude, whereas the intensity of radiated sunlight, especially the higher energies, gets higher as we go into space. You kind of end up with a sweet spot or a balance where you've got an optimum set of conditions for producing your concentration of ions and electrons. So this is the bare bones of what's going on with particularly the F region, but also the E region. But the E region is a bit more complicated because it is much lower down, embedded in the atmosphere. And as I say, the reason there are multiple ripples and F1s and various other things going on is because it's not even as simple as that balance between pressure and density. You have changes in the types and the spectral identity of the emissions from the sun, the amount of X-rays and extreme ultraviolets. Now they change quite considerably with solar cycle. So although that would say that the total amount of sunlight reaching the Earth and the visible light doesn't change much with solar cycle, it does radically alter the upper regions of the ionosphere. And I'm sure you all know that because of the consequences it has to the formation of the ionosphere. What also changes is that it becomes a height, and it's about it's actually at the mesopause, which is just about where the E region is, and that is the coldest part of the atmosphere, but it's also the height at which the mass and the effect of gravity on each individual mass means that they start to fall off, diminish and go off into space at different rates depending upon their actual atomic mass. So rather than have one curve like this, you have a whole set of different curves for the different types of gases splitting off. And that, of course, makes it very complicated for this kind of balancing act between the UV, the composition, and what you end up with is this balance for ions and electrons. So that's the reason why there are complicated structures, and the reason why it changes with seasons and the like. So, ionosondes. Ionosondes are just simply radars. They're one of the very first, actually. Possibly, no, not quite the first. But they're often not referred to as that. But they are. And what they really are doing is, if the density of electrons is pretty well increasing, you're trying to measure this increase. We can't measure it if it goes over the top and comes back again, because you can't see through the lower region. But for each density of electrons, there's a natural resonance frequency. Basically, the electrons will have a particular frequency, depending on how many particles are around them, how many charges and how many neutrals are surrounding them. There'll be a natural frequency for them to oscillate at, and that's the plasma frequency. And what we do with the Ionosonde is that we send up a digital pulse, which will encounter appropriate densities in the ionosphere, because we're sweeping up in frequency, where we'll get strong echoes, and eventually we'll reach a point where, in fact, yes, that's what we do. We measure the time of flight So we count up and down. But eventually, when we ramp up the frequencies, you saw it there appear and then disappear. Well, I should never do that. It always hangs when you do that. Eventually, what happens is you reach a frequency where you're in perfect resonance with the electrons, and your signal disappears because it's absorbed and turned into heat at that altitude. If you go a little bit beyond it, it then is basically just flying off into space. And this mechanism explains what our echoes, our return echoes, look like. As I say, we sweep in frequency, and we record at the time of flight. So as we approach each of these bumps, and as I say, we can't see, once it goes beyond, like the valley there, we can't see that, we can't measure that. What we see is basically these echoes, as they get more and more absorbed, you're basically getting an asymptote as it reaches the critical frequencies, so it's going off into space. So it's these turning points here that we call and identify as the critical frequencies that are noted down and then broadcast to communications users. And we call this radar picture an ionogram. And there are a number of features in these ionograms of the different characteristics, some of which you may use, some of which you will not, that determine things like the MUF and the M3000. So these are a list of these, just the basic ones. In fact, there's an entire book written out with nuances and seasons and everything that's ever been seen in ionograms. But these are the basic components. Mostly, all you need to know is the FO, F2 is the one you're mostly concerned with, which is the peak frequency of the F layer, the F2 layer, and the height of the F2 layer. And the reason there's an O and an X for the F region, in fact for the whole ionogram, is because we send up two polarizations, and because the Earth's magnetic field has a specific orientation, you get a different delay from the polarization that comes back that's parallel to the magnetic field and that which isn't. So if it's perpendicular to the field, it doesn't actually see you don't necessarily see the field, but you can with the X-ray. So that gap actually gives you an indication of what the magnetic field is, especially, and it's like you can work out what the dip angle is. This is actual ionogram. This is one of ours from Port Stanley, and this is the kind of thing that we're trying to find out these parameters from. And you can see that it's not as easy as you probably thought from the sketches. And this is why it's actually quite complicated for an automated system to pick out the parameters. Now, there is some automated software that's producing all the parameters you're familiar with here. And in fact, its best guess as to what the ionosphere is doing is this black line here, tracing out the O region. And the software also then works out what it thinks the real profile of the electron density is. Notice again, no topside, because of course we don't have any information on that. But you could hazard a guess from nowadays from topside sounders that have filled some of that information in. So here's another, this is from Millstone Hill, which is the Ionosonde from the company that make the ones that we have. And here you can see extra features coming in, it's like an F1, and you can see too that the profile has been filled in and computed up, including, it essentially is a guess, an educated guess as to what's happening on the top side. But also you can see here a second bounce coming in, which of course is the skywave, ground, skywave, and then ground again. Sometimes you see multiple bounces through the ionograms. And here's a couple of a sequence of ionographs during an event on March the 7th, 2012, and you can just see how the ionosphere responds, and how the ionograms actually display a sequence of changes in the F region, E regions, both in the heights and in the magnitudes, the peak frequencies. And this, of course, has consequent effects on your MUFs and the ability to reach for higher frequencies in your communications. And I want to show a bit of the history, because there is this connection between the creation of Ionosondes in the first place, knowledge of its existence, and Rutherford Appleton. And it may not be a political thing to say, but it will come towards the end of my talk in a few minutes, where I'm going to ask for some help in regards to this, to maintain this history. Now, this is the Rutherford Appleton lab. It's actually got more buildings now, because it's the Harwell Business Innovation Centre campus, possibly campus. So this is the diamond light source, and this is another particle accelerator, which is actually underground. One's electrons, one's ions, and it produces neutrons. Space Science Building is here, and we have a couple of dishes, and the Ionosondes is out here, out the back, and it's very hard to photograph on any high altitude picture like that. And as I say, we're just near the A34 over there, and you're welcome to come and visit and see the equipment any time. We also have a beacon, which thanks to Mike Willis, which used to be in my office, actually, because I've moved offices now. And here's a picture of one of the very first Ionosondes. This one used to be the first one to make a routine Ionosonde measurements and didn't park. So it's remarkable how little has actually changed, actually. Because if you look again at this 933, I don't know what stage they stopped having to manually scan through the frequencies with a big wheel. I think it's still past the next one. That still looks suspiciously like that might be done manually, I don't know. But it's, again, not much has changed. It's a very familiar looking equipment. And the era of wearing the lab coat. And a little trolley. 1957. And 20 years ago, that's now retired engineer John Smith, and the current Ionosonde. I think that's when it was new, which was about 1993. And you might actually like some of the... We have the complete archive of not only the Chiltern Ionosonde, but a lot of the Ionosondes that the British Empire in its day recorded around the world, places like Singapore. A unique archive. A lot of it on things like tracing paper and microfiche and stuff. So we have been going for the past couple of years systematically trying to digitise it, to maintain it, because the means funds to support proper archiving and maintenance in the right kind of environment is continually a battle that we have to fight for this and all the data. But the value of our station is that we've got this 85-year record from Slough, coming not too bad from the Falklands record. So this is from the 1930s up until about 2010. You can see here the blue is the FOE. Then there's FO1 in green and the FOF2 in red. And you can see the effects of the 22-year solar cycle, to give it its proper period, which is the sunspot oscillations. And we've also been able to do things like determine climate change indicators in the upper atmosphere. There is a growing concern or belief that we can actually see global changes more clearly in changes in the ionosphere, in the upper atmosphere, which is actually above most of the Met Office models, but you can actually see these changes more clearly in the ionosphere. Things like the height of the F2 has been going lower, which is been seen in the Falklands and in Stanley. So, and of course, it's not just one Ionosonde anymore. This is a remarkably populous plot of the total number of Ionosondes that there are and never have been, I have to state. In case you're curious, the ones in the oceans are mostly French, except for places like Hawaii and Ascension Island. And the lot of the countries, like Australia, are very keen on monitoring the HF because it's still used as one of their primary communication means rather than satellites, just because of sheer size of the country. The UK and through the Falklands were responsible for determining the ionospheric propagation conditions for NATO for the southern hemisphere, for the South Atlantic, I mean. And it's a particularly important location, as some of you may know, because it's below the South Atlantic ionospheric anomaly, which is where the Earth's magnetic field is closest to the Earth's surface. So a lot of satellite upsets happen in this region. It's an interesting area of the planet. And this combined network is available to produce maps of course changes and motions of the Earth's ionization in the ionosphere. This is not particularly useful for detailed communications, but it does give you an indication of, because some of these are compared directly with models, and it gives you an idea of when the big changes happen, what you're looking at. Now, throughout this talk, I've been using this image as a backdrop, and I wonder if you probably guessed that it was aurora, but actually it's not. It's not tungsten clouds. Now, these are a form of clouds that you can only see about an hour or so after sunset, because they're up at about 80 kilometres. So what these are, it's not the ionosphere, but it's a little bit below it, but it gives you an indication, the best visual indication you can get, of what you're trying to bounce your radio signals off, in a horizontal sense. We've talked about the vertical sense. And you can see all this detail and clumps and ripples going off, and it does explain a lot of what you hear, I'm sure. Now, just as I come to a close, I'm going to say a little bit about what we observed during the solar eclipse on March the 20th. Now, eclipses are quite interesting things, not just in general, because they're beautiful and spectacular and an amazing coincidence. For our ionospheric interests, they produce a unique set of circumstances where we've got a test function, a test disturbance on the ionosphere. We know exactly what's happening, and we know when and where. Because essentially you've got a 100-kilometre wide shadow going across the ionosphere. Now this plot, this shows the path of totality on the ground, which is the blue, and the path of totality in the D layer, which is the orange, the E layer, yellow, and the F region in green. Now you notice that, and of course, they're not coincident. Each eclipse provides a unique circumstance for us to examine. And when we had the one in '99, the inclination of the sun to the Earth's surface was not so steep. This is actually quite an interesting, almost horizontal, also because of the time of year being close to the equinox. It was pretty well horizontal, so it was separate the layers, and you see them in different geographical locations. So even this eclipse is different from the one we had in '99, where there was a bit more of an overlap. So that's a photograph I took from Chiltern, from the roof of the building. Pretty. This is actually the F regions for us didn't show dramatic changes, but the E layer did. We got a real noticeable dip in the E layer. Now the E layer being much more in the atmosphere, of course, if you turn the light out, it will actually recombine, and the ionization will disappear a lot quicker than in the F region. The F region is pretty well collisionless and will last around a lot longer. And you'll see this effect in the propagation work, because of course the layer that most strongly affects to put the lights out is the D layer. So you lose your signal strength absorption. So you should be getting nighttime conditions for the lower half of the ionosphere and daytime conditions for the upper half. Hence the fun of an eclipse. I think if I actually said in words, would have shown this graphic. It looks old and bitmappy, it's because it is actually from the work we did in 1999, which shows exactly what you'd expect to encounter, unique circumstances of the upper layer. So you'd hear, and I'm sure Steve's going to go into this, nighttime stations feeding in during the eclipse period, which you wouldn't otherwise hear. And this, because we had the Ionosonde directly below totality for the 99 eclipse, we were actually able to see the relative changes in each of the layers throughout the period of the eclipse. I'm a bit aware of time, I think this, in some ways it's probably going to be better covered by Steve, how the eclipses are kind of like the opposite of us studying a shortwave fade out in a controlled manner. So just as a coming to a close, that's come out appallingly badly. Here's coming, no, not quite to the pleading, but these are not good times for funding science. And the science, when I had one person say to me, well, you've got 85 years, isn't that enough? So it's a different attitude. It also isn't sexy, considered because of its heritage. The Chiltern Ionosonde has only got 2 of the receive antennas working at the moment, partly because the engineer is so pressed for time working on other things. But the things like the motherboard for the Ionosondes that we got as a Digison is actually a 486, and he's actually bought up all the motherboards he could from eBay a couple of years ago, because as they pop, he can't replace them with anything else. He's got a design we worked on for the last couple of years for what we call the cheapest chips Ionosonde, a proper scientific Ionosonde, not a semi-military one, but just for monitoring. Nowadays we don't have to do a lot of those approximations to get those signals, to get those key parameters that you might put in an inerciogram or ionogram that gets circulated to communication users. We can do a lot better. Most of it will be done post-analysis. And we can also determine a lot more, because we don't have to restrict the amount of data you save to just the ionogram. We can get the full phase and signal strength information. And from that we can determine essentially a 4-dimensional, and I do mean 4-dimensional, volume of the ionosphere above each station. Now, because each station communicates with each other station via the ionosphere, you could then have each station listening to each other station. So you would end up with a network of Ionosondes that are, say, just even across Europe, that are actually producing a full slab of the Earth's upper atmosphere, pretty well being monitored in real time, and a lot of characteristics that we can't see at the moment. The scintillation, you'd actually see clumps and be able to determine the valley, because actually if you measure the signal strength, you can determine approximately how, if you calibrate it absolute, you can determine approximately how deep that valley is in the ionospheric profile, something that you can't do at the moment. It really is cheap as chips, because basically everything is, PCs and electronics, and then shift the frequencies up to RF and pipe it out on some wires. What we want to do now also is to use phased arrays. There is I don't have a view graph of this, but there is an astronomy facility, which I don't know if anyone here knows of it, which works in HF. It works from about 10 megahertz up to about 250 megahertz. It's a phased array, and it's based mostly in Holland, but we have one of the stations in Chilbolton. Perhaps actually for next year you might. Well, I could give you this person who deals with that, because you'd enjoy that. Great fun set of antennas, a field full of antennas doing phased arrays. Now, of course, with a phased array, you can get far more information than with single or several looped antennas. So our idea is to combine the two, and especially since a lot of the equipment is available. But we need technically competent and willing people to come and help us do this, because we've had this design for about 10 years, and we need people that would take it seriously, and also not just build them willy-nilly all over the place and have everyone transmitting all over the place, because, as somebody said, it can get awfully noisy. A new Ionosonde would work at very low powers, we reckon about 100 milliwatts. Because you don't need it, because if it's digital, you know what you're looking for. You don't need to blast the airwaves with a big beast. So we certainly have lots of this. And what we need is lots of this. That's just me personally. And so if anyone wants to discuss how they might be able to help, I know Steve's already discussed this, we reckon in the next 2 or 3 years, particularly the Stanley one, is going to fall to bits. We're keeping it going by the fact that that team of scientists, they didn't say we were funded to work on it. In fact, none of us are. And we haven't been for quite a long time. But we understand the value of it and what it could be. But it's not the time to try and get this. So you're a brilliant community to help us out with this. So with that, I'd like to end with our details of how you might be able to help, and I hope to take any questions that anyone might have. Thank you.
You mentioned in passing top down. Do we have Ionosondes from above?
We have had Ionosondes from above, topside sounders. I don't think there's one currently flying around the Earth, and I do mean that. There is one flying around Mars. Maven has a topside sounder, although Mars doesn't have a proper ionosphere because it hasn't got a magnetic field. It does have magnetic anomalies, and it does sort of form a bit of an ionosphere and a magnetosphere right in its atmosphere.
I was also very interested to see that you mentioned a correlation with weather, and I'm sure Jim will notice this. There looks to be a very similar shape over the same sort of altitude as tetragrams and so on. And I've been talking to a friend of mine who's a forecaster, and he's been telling me that there has been generally an acceptance that sun science and the area of interest that you've been looking at is beginning to show more interest. So when you said you could see things about long-term trends, global warming and so on, that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, well, Steve's going to cover from the ionosphere upwards. Involvement with the ionosphere, but that's right. All the Met Office models at the moment don't go higher than, I think, about 15 or 20 kilometres into the troposphere. They reckon everything above that is, it's getting too complicated and it doesn't feed into it much. You listen to other people who are saying, but this is precisely why there are differences. Why does the Rossby wave, which is a wave, the winds that form our general pattern of weather here in the UK, are because we're actually in a zonal flow, which is a barrier between flow around the Arctic and a nice Gulf Stream down below. We're at the turbulent, messy boundary between those two zones. And what you get is inexplicable reasons why at some point that might be stable a bit higher or a bit lower than it has been for quite a while. We had that a few years ago. Now, we had that a few years ago, if you remember, there was around actually the time of the volcano. That's totally disconnected, but you remember when the volcano did stop all the air flights? It was beautiful weather and everything, kind of an indication we were getting extremely good weather for quite a while, quite stable. And what was happening is that this Rossby, this boundary between the two zones had actually moved south and had been stably south. So the French were getting our weather, and we were getting Scottish weather, which was a bit more stable though colder. So, but interestingly, this is also around the time that the sun was in a protracted minimum, an unusual minimum, which happens every 100 and something years. I know there was a very long one during the Maundy minimum, but every now and then it does kind of like a 5-year quiet time, which is possibly related. Now, this is more speculative, but it's possibly related to the alignment of the planets. I know that sounds like astrology, but it isn't. It's because the barycenter of the solar system is outside the sun at the time. And if you think about the thing that forms the sunspots, is the stirring of the sun. If you move the centre of rotation outside it, it stirs in a different way than it does when it's inside. So if they're all on one side. So the things are believed to be related. They're tricky to work out exactly how, because they're long latencies. Anyway, yes, sorry, I prattled on onto other little rabbit holes.
You've got another 5 minutes.
Oh, right. Well, perhaps anyone else a question?
I was a little puzzled about the polarisation used by the Ionosonde. So you've got pairs of loops of right angles, presumably to get the circularly polarised ordinary and extraordinary waves separated. What's the polarisation going on?
Well, John. I see John right there at the back, because I just saw you. It is a requirement that the Ionosonde engineer's name is John. The guy in the picture previously was John Smith, and after him there was a John Wright, and now there's a John Bradford. So you could ask John. Hi. Well, we do send up both polarisations, basically, because they're crossed. That was your question? Yeah. Yeah. So if you do it one way. So, and the thing is, we have the four in a sort of triangle arrangement so that we can see, because it's all GPS locked, when the phase fronts come to each of the ionosondes. Unfortunately, with the current commercial system, a lot of that information is thrown away. We can now use it. It was thrown away historically because you couldn't store it and record it and do anything with it in time in the older days. And the commercial ionosondes were essentially a cheap option for us because they're sold to the military to put in the back of a lorry and take to theatre. I understand it's called. War to you and me. Sorry, there's a question over here.
This question is about the standard ELAC, not sporadic. It's not really noted that much in the literature, certainly in our hobby. Is there a reason for that?
I don't know. I think the thing is, sporadic is often considered a dark art. It's not. It's known what it is, but you still can't predict exactly when it's going to occur. Yeah, what the standard ELAC?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem to get much attention, but it seems to be very sort of regular and very easy to predict.
Yeah, basically.
We don't talk about it much as well if there's a reason for that.
Well, it is much. It's much more predictable than the F region. Because as I say, if there are, for instance, one of the reasons why the things like the heights change is if there's a lot of solar radiation being absorbed by the upper atmosphere, the atmosphere swells up during sunspot maximum. And so you actually then get a different heights at which the elements separate, different absorption levels, and the spectrum of the sun has changed. So it's awfully complicated. But the E layer is much more predictable as to what it actually, how it's formed, and when it will occur. You know what magnitude it will be roughly. If you happen to know exactly what the spectrum of the sun is, sporadic E is different because it's to do with shear winds, and we don't know what they are.
But I mean, there's people say that the ELAB is absorptive, whereas the Ionosonde sort of data sort of indicates that it's purely reflective. I mean, is that?
No, they're all to some extent absorbing. You notice how the ionogram starts to go. It's actually very complicated how the radio waves propagate in an ionized media. They're actually going evanescent. So you've actually got phase velocity faster than the speed of light, progressively as they reach the critical frequency. When they hit the critical frequency, there's no, it's absorbed. So you actually see that happening. I forgot what your question was then. What was the question?
I mean, we don't talk about it much in the hobby. I mean,
yeah.
People think that it's absorptive, but it's not. It's actually, well, as far as I see it, it's reflective like the F-layer.
Well, there is two types of absorption. Yeah, there's non-deviative, which is this stuff to do with the D and the E layer, and then there's the deviative absorption, which is to do with you trying. If you're close to the muff, you're actually propagating close to the local plasma frequencies. That's a different type of absorption. If you have a muff that's far above you and you're using a frequency further down, you won't get so much of this, but you'll still get this. and this will depend on the conditions at the time, day and night and whatnot. So you will always get signal absorption because, in fact, all the way through the electrons that are being stimulated by the radio waves, they will be in part reflecting and in part absorbing and in part transmitting, because what they're really doing is just re-oscillating in every direction. So there is a continuous absorption. What there isn't is proper quantitative regulations or numbers on this in the ITU regulations to do with broadcasting, and a lot of lack of understanding. There's a research instrument up in Tromsø called IRIS that actually measures absorption in the ionosphere, but I don't think that information is propagated down into the regulations anymore. Actually, since we lost RA, that kind of link between the science and what might be used in applications is not being funded down in this country. Don't.
A very good question. Earlier you talked about studies with the ionosphere and climate change. Is there any similar studies with the ionosphere and pollution?
I don't know, actually. That's actually a good question. There are studies like the ionosphere and earthquakes. That would be a very good question. There's still trace elements, but that would be worth a Google search, but actually I don't know. There are waves that propagate between the two and stuff and things. Anyway, yes, now I should shut up.
No, I really want to thank Ruth, that's fantastic. The reason I'm going to stop and now is because we know there's other sessions starting right now, and some of you might want to leg it, although I've noticed that you haven't, so that's very good. I think if we could just thank Ruth for an excellent... Okay, we're going to have a short break now, then we'll come back and talk about propagation, and I'll try and take what some of Ruth has said and apply it to how we can use it as radio amateurs. One quick point about the E layer is, most of what we do, we tend to use higher frequencies that are reflected off the F2 layer. So it's only really top band, I think, 1.8 megs that is...
E layer goes up to about maybe 7 and
maybe
high
7. So
high
either 80 metres or top band that's really reflective of the E layer. So we really, generally, with the HF bands, we're talking about the F2 layer, which is more interesting. Anyway, we'll see you all, or some of you, if you want to come back, you might not want to. See you all at 5 o'clock. Thanks. Put the light back.
Yeah?
You mentioned GPS. Does REL contribute towards the ionospheric
yes,
corrections?
we do. We have... again, actually, I arranged that.